If you've ever felt the ground shift beneath you when the person you raised starts rewriting your story in front of other people, this is going to hit you deep. Because there's a particular kind of heartbreak in realizing that the voice trying to discredit you is coming from inside your own family. The day my daughter told everyone I was losing my mind, I felt something inside me go very still. What I didn't know was that a single question from a bank investigator would unravel the story she'd been telling, and the silence that followed would say more than any argument ever could. For most of my adult life, being steady wasn't something I thought about. It was just the way I lived. I paid attention to details, because that's how you keep a household running. I wrote things down, because memory can slip when life gets busy, not because I didn't trust my mind, but because I respected it enough to support it. People who knew me well used words like reliable and careful when they described me. I never imagined those same qualities would one day be reframed as signs of decline by the person I had raised to value them. Raising my daughter after her father passed meant learning how to be consistent even when I was tired, to be present even when grief pressed in quietly at the edges of the day. I showed up to school meetings. I kept our routines simple and predictable, because children find safety in repetition. Over time, that consistency became part of my identity. I didn't make impulsive decisions. I thought things through. I taught my daughter to do the same. Those habits weren't just practical. They were a way of honoring the life we were trying to rebuild after loss. When she grew older and started moving through the world with her own sense of confidence, I took pride in seeing how easily she navigated social spaces. She could talk her way into opportunities. She could charm people into giving her the benefit of the doubt. I admired that about her, because it was different from me. Where I was methodical, she was fluid. Where I liked plans, she liked possibilities. Those differences felt complementary when she was younger. They felt like proof that I had raised someone who could move in ways I never had. The first time she hinted that I might be struggling to keep up, it caught me off guard. The comment was small, framed as concern, as if she was simply noticing that I carried too much responsibility on my own. I laughed it off, because it didn't match my lived reality. I was doing the same things I had always done. I wasn't forgetting appointments. I wasn't missing payments. My routines were intact. I had systems that worked for me, systems I had built over years of trial and error. What unsettled me wasn't the suggestion itself. It was how easily it slipped into the narrative she began to share with others. I would hear from someone that she was worried about me, that she thought I might be getting confused. The words sounded caring on the surface, but they carried an undertone that didn't align with the reality of how I was living. It was strange to recognize myself in those descriptions, and not recognize the person being described. The steady woman I knew myself to be was being slowly replaced in other people's minds by a version of me that felt unfamiliar and fragile. There's a particular disorientation that comes with having your identity rewritten while you're still living it. I would go about my days paying bills, organizing paperwork, managing the small details of my life with the same attention I always had, and then hear that someone had told a story about me that suggested I was slipping. The contrast between my internal experience and the external narrative created a quiet tension. I began to pay closer attention to how I moved through the world, not because I doubted myself, but because I could feel the story about me shifting in rooms I wasn't in. Being known for steadiness meant that people had come to rely on me in small ways. Neighbors asked me to look at their mail. Friends asked me to keep track of details for shared plans. That history didn't disappear overnight, but the suggestion that I was changing planted a seed of doubt in some people's minds. Doubt doesn't need to be loud to be effective. It just needs to be repeated often enough to feel plausible. Watching that doubt take root was painful not because it threatened my actual abilities, but because it threatened the story of who I was in my community. What hurt most was the realization that the person reshaping that story was my own daughter. I had raised her to be observant, to notice details, to speak up when something didn't seem right. Seeing those traits turned into tools for quietly undermining my competence forced me to confront how trust can be repurposed when motivations shift. The steadiness I had modeled for her had become something she now framed as rigidity or decline, and that reframing carried consequences beyond our relationship. It shaped how others approached me, how they interpreted my choices, how they understood my capacity to care for my own life. What unsettled me most wasn't just that my daughter wanted to help. It was how quickly help began to sound like control when it wasn't invited. There's a fine line between offering support and assuming authority over someone else's life, and that line can blur easily when love and convenience mix together. At first, her offers felt gentle, framed as concern for my well-being. She would suggest that handling finances must be stressful for me, that it might be easier if she took over some of the responsibilities. The language she used was soft, but the direction it pointed in was clear. I noticed the shift in how she spoke to me before I noticed the shift in what she was doing. Her tone changed from asking to telling. She began to phrase things as if the decision had already been made, as if my agreement were a formality rather than a choice. I caught myself nodding along to suggestions I hadn't actually accepted, simply because it felt easier in the moment to avoid friction. That ease came at a cost. Each small concession reinforced the idea that she knew better than I did how my life should be managed. The narrative she began to share with others followed the same pattern. What started as concern became a story of incapacity. She told people she was worried about me, that I was getting overwhelmed, that I was forgetting things. None of those claims matched my lived experience, but they were framed in a way that made them sound reasonable to anyone who didn't know my routines as intimately as I did. Concern is an effective disguise for control, because it invites sympathy while quietly positioning the other person as less capable. I found myself in the strange position of having to defend my own competence, something I had never needed to do before. Defensiveness is an uncomfortable place to stand, especially when the challenge to your capacity comes from someone you love. I didn't want to believe that her concern carried an agenda. It felt easier to accept the surface explanation, that she was just trying to help. That ease, however, required me to ignore the growing mismatch between her story about me and the reality of how I was functioning. As the pattern continued, I began to notice small disruptions in my routines. Mail went missing. Documents I had organized carefully were no longer where I had left them. When I asked about these changes, she explained them away as efficiency, as improvements she had made on my behalf. The explanations were plausible enough to be accepted in the moment, but they added up to a quiet erosion of my control over my own affairs. The line between assistance and interference had been crossed without a clear conversation about consent. Gaslighting often doesn't look like overt lies. It looks like a steady drip of reframing that causes you to question your own perceptions. When she told me that switching things to paperless would be easier for me, I momentarily wondered if I had asked for that and forgotten. When she suggested I was getting confused about dates, I paused to double-check my calendar, even though my system had worked reliably for years. Those pauses weren't signs that I was losing my mind. They were signs that her narrative was beginning to create doubt where none had existed before. What made the situation especially painful was the way her framing invited others to treat me differently. Friends spoke to me more slowly. Relatives asked if I needed reminders. The concern in their voices was genuine, but it was built on a story that wasn't true. That story positioned me as fragile, as someone whose autonomy could be quietly negotiated away for her own good. Watching that happen felt like standing inside a version of my life that someone else was trying to script. Control disguised as concern thrives in the absence of clear boundaries. I realized, too late, that my desire to avoid conflict had created space for that disguise to work. Each time I let a small assumption go unchallenged, the narrative gained strength. It became easier for her to speak for me, to decide for me, to explain my life in ways that served her interests. Recognizing that pattern forced me to confront the importance of naming boundaries even when doing so feels uncomfortable. Love doesn't require surrendering your agency. Concern doesn't entitle someone to rewrite your reality. The moment the investigator asked his question, the room seemed to narrow around us. It wasn't an accusatory question. It was simple, factual, and delivered with a calm that suggested he was more interested in clarity than confrontation. That simplicity is what made it so powerful. Complex stories can hide behind emotion, but facts have a way of standing on their own. When he asked my daughter to explain the transfers, he wasn't challenging her character. He was inviting her to account for a series of actions that required explanation. Her confidence, which had filled the room moments earlier, wavered. The smoothness with which she had spoken for me faltered when she was asked to speak for herself. I could see her searching for a version of the story that would fit the evidence in front of us. The words came, but they didn't land cleanly. Dates blurred. Reasons overlapped in ways that didn't align. Each attempt to explain created more questions, not fewer. The narrative she had built about protecting me from my own supposed confusion couldn't hold up against the precision of the investigator's inquiry. What struck me at that moment was how quickly the balance of credibility shifted. For weeks, her version of events had carried weight because it was presented as concern. Concern tends to be believed, especially when it comes from family. The investigator's question cut through that framing by focusing on concrete actions rather than on intentions. He wasn't asking whether she meant well. He was asking what had been done and why. That shift from motive to action exposed the gap between the story she had told and the reality of what had occurred. I didn't feel triumphant watching her struggle to answer. The room was too heavy for that. What I felt was a strange sense of grounding. The doubt that had been planted in me by her narrative loosened its grip. Hearing the facts laid out so plainly reminded me that my experience of events had been accurate all along. The transfers had happened without my consent. The paperwork had been moved without my approval. The story about me losing my mind had been a cover for actions that couldn't be justified on their own merits. The investigator turned to me and asked for confirmation. The simplicity of his request mirrored the simplicity of his earlier question. Did I authorize these transfers? The word no came out of me without hesitation. It wasn't defiance. It was clear. At that moment, I wasn't defending myself against an accusation of confusion. I was stating a fact about my own choices. That distinction mattered. It shifted my role in the room from someone whose capacity was in question to someone whose consent had been violated. The silence that followed her inability to answer carried weight. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the absence of the narrative she had been using to frame the situation. Without that narrative, the room had to confront a different reality. The concern she had displayed now looked like strategy. The help she had offered now looked like overreach. The story about my decline now looked like a convenient explanation for behavior that couldn't stand on its own. There's a particular kind of justice in having a story unravel through its own inconsistencies. No one raised their voice. No one accused her directly at that moment. The facts did the work. The investigator's role wasn't to shame her. It was to document what had happened. In doing so, he inadvertently dismantled the narrative she had been using to protect herself from scrutiny. That dismantling didn't require emotional confrontation. It required attention to detail. What stayed with me after that moment wasn't the discomfort on her face. It was the realization that truth doesn't need to be dramatic to be effective. A single, well-placed question can pierce through layers of misdirection more cleanly than hours of argument. The power of that question lay in its focus on accountability rather than on intention. It didn't ask her to explain why she had felt justified. It asked her to explain what she had done. That focus reframed the entire situation, grounding it in reality rather than in narrative, and in that grounding, the story she had built about me quietly collapsed. There was no satisfaction in watching my daughter struggle to answer the investigator's question. The moment wasn't about winning. It was about watching a false story lose its footing when it encountered something solid. For weeks, her version of events had shaped how people looked at me, how they spoke to me, how they interpreted my actions. That version had carried weight, because it appealed to concern, because it framed itself as care. Seeing it unravel wasn't gratifying. It was grounding. It reminded me that truth doesn't need to be defended with volume when it's anchored in facts. Quiet revenge doesn't look like celebration. It looks like restraint. It looks like letting reality take the lead without inserting extra emotion into the process. I didn't need to raise my voice or recount every moment when her behavior had felt off. The investigator's presence and the simple clarity of his questions did that work for me. The narrative that painted me as confused couldn't survive contact with documented transfers and missing authorizations. The revenge wasn't in her discomfort. It was in the restoration of my credibility. Restoration is a subtle form of justice. It doesn't undo what has been said, but it rebalances the space where those words once held power. The people who had begun to see me through the lens of her concern now had to reconcile that image with the evidence in front of them. That reconciliation didn't happen out loud. It happened in the shift of attention, in the way questions were now directed to her rather than to me, in the way my responses were received without the quiet skepticism that had begun to accompany them. What made the moment feel like revenge was the contrast between how easily my competence had been questioned and how difficult it was for her to explain her actions when asked plainly. That contrast exposed the asymmetry of trust within families. We often extend trust to those who speak with confidence, especially when they position themselves as caretakers. We rarely require the same level of scrutiny from them that we require from those they claim to be protecting. Watching that dynamic reverse, even briefly, brought a sense of balance back into the room. There's a quiet dignity in not needing to prove your sanity to anyone. For a while, I had felt the need to demonstrate my competence, to reassure people that I was fine, that I hadn't changed, that I was still myself. That need was exhausting because it asked me to perform normalcy in response to a narrative that shouldn't have existed in the first place. The investigator's intervention lifted that burden. It shifted the focus from my supposed decline to her concrete actions. That shift was a form of vindication that didn't require me to argue for it. Quiet revenge also protected me from becoming hardened by the experience. It allowed me to hold my daughter accountable without letting anger define how the situation unfolded. Anger would have been understandable, but it might have complicated the clarity of what was happening. By allowing the process to move forward without adding emotional intensity, I preserved a sense of self that wasn't shaped by retaliation. The truth emerged cleanly, without being entangled in the heat of confrontation. The restoration of my credibility didn't mean the relationship between us was suddenly healed. It meant the power to define reality had shifted back into a more balanced place. I was no longer the subject of a story about decline. I was a person whose consent had been violated. That distinction changed the emotional ground beneath us. It reframed the harm not as a misunderstanding, but as a boundary that had been crossed. In that reframing, there was a quiet sense of justice that didn't depend on punishment. It depended on clarity. The clarity that comes when facts replace narratives, when questions replace assumptions, when the person who has been spoken for is finally asked to speak for herself. That clarity didn't erase the pain of betrayal, but it restored a sense of reality that had been threatened by the story that tried to take my place. Reclaiming reality, after someone has tried to rewrite, it is both grounding and disorienting at the same time. For a while, I had lived inside a subtle distortion, where the version of me that existed in other people's minds didn't quite match the woman I experienced myself to be. That distortion doesn't vanish instantly when the truth comes out. It loosens gradually, like a fog lifting in patches rather than all at once. The process of reclaiming my own narrative required more than a single moment of validation. It required intentional boundaries and a willingness to reassert my voice in spaces where it had been quietly replaced. One of the hardest parts of reclaiming reality was letting go of the instinct to explain myself. For weeks, I had found myself offering extra details about my routines, my memory, my decisions, as if preemptively defending against doubts that might surface. That habit didn't disappear the moment the investigator's question exposed the lie. Habits formed in response to gaslighting tend to linger, because they are built as protective strategies. Releasing that reflex meant trusting that my reality didn't need constant reinforcement to be valid. Setting boundaries with my daughter was painful in ways that were different from the initial betrayal. Betrayal shocks you. Boundaries require you to live with the consequences of that shock over time. It meant being clear about what access she had to my finances and my paperwork. It meant insisting on transparency where there had once been assumption. It meant tolerating the discomfort that came with changing a dynamic that had been quietly shifting toward imbalance. Boundaries aren't punitive. They are protective. They create conditions where trust has to be rebuilt rather than assumed. Reclaiming my reality also meant repairing how I related to other people. Some friends and relatives had internalized the story that I was slipping, even if they hadn't intended to hurt me. I didn't confront them with anger. I showed them, over time, through consistency, that I was the same person I had always been. Consistency is a slow form of truth. It doesn't demand belief. It invites it through repetition. Each interaction became an opportunity to re-establish who I was in practice rather than in narrative. There was a subtle grief in realizing how easily doubt can take root when it's planted by someone close to you. That grief wasn't just about my daughter's actions. It was about the vulnerability that comes with trusting someone enough to let them speak for you. Reclaiming my narrative meant accepting that trust has to be accompanied by discernment. Love doesn't require surrendering your voice. Care doesn't require relinquishing your agency. As I reasserted boundaries, I noticed how my sense of self steadied. The small acts of taking control back over my own paperwork, my own accounts, my own decisions reinforced something fundamental about who I was. I wasn't reclaiming competence. I had never lost it. I was reclaiming the right to have that competence recognized without qualification. That distinction mattered, because it separated my identity from the story that had been imposed on me. The process also clarified what kind of relationship I was willing to maintain. Moving forward, love didn't have to mean unlimited access. Family didn't have to mean unquestioned authority. I could care about my daughter and still insist on boundaries that protected my autonomy. That realization reshaped how I understood connection. It showed me that closeness is healthier when it's grounded in mutual respect rather than in assumed entitlement. Reclaiming reality is an ongoing practice rather than a single victory. It's the daily choice to trust your own experience, to name your boundaries, and to resist narratives that diminish your agency. The quiet revenge in this story wasn't about watching my daughter face consequences. It was about refusing to let anyone else define who I am or how capable I am of living my own life.